In June 1944, 5,200 Soviet tanks smashed through German lines in Operation Bagration, advancing 200 kilometers in days. But what if German commanders had heeded the warnings? What if those same 5,200 tanks had driven straight into prepared kill zones instead of achieving complete surprise? The difference between breakthrough and catastrophe often comes down to a single factor: intelligence. This is the story of an alternate history, a timeline where General Reinhardt's warnings were heard, where Soviet Maskirovka failed, where 2.3 million Soviet soldiers and thousands of tanks drove headlong into the one thing that could stop them, an enemy that knew they were coming. The historical Operation Bagration destroyed German Army Group Center and opened the road to Berlin. But it didn't have to happen that way. The margin between victory and disaster was razor thin, measured in dismissed intelligence reports and successful deception. This is what happens when that margin shifts the other way. General Georg Hans Reinhardt commanded the German 3rd Panzer Army in the spring of 1944. His position stretched along the northern sector of Army Group Center in Belarus. Throughout May and early June, his intelligence officers brought him troubling reports. Soviet partisan activity was spiking. Radio intercepts suggested major troop movements. Frontline patrols reported increased probing attacks. Reinhardt documented everything. He sent detailed reports up the chain of command to Army Group Center headquarters and to the Oberkommando des Heeres in Berlin. His warnings were dismissed. Hitler and the High Command were convinced the main Soviet summer offensive would strike Army Group North Ukraine, far to the south. The Führer had ordered most of Germany's panzer reserves concentrated there, leaving Army Group Center dangerously exposed. The intelligence officers in Berlin looked at Reinhardt's reports and filed them away. Another nervous commander, seeing ghosts in the forests of Belarus. But in this alternate timeline, something different happens. A Luftwaffe reconnaissance flight penetrates deeper than usual over Soviet-held territory. The pilot is experienced, the weather is clear, and for once Soviet fighter cover has a gap. His cameras capture images of tank parks near Smolensk, hundreds of vehicles poorly camouflaged. The photos reach intelligence analysts who cross-reference them with Reinhardt's ground reports. Suddenly the pattern becomes clear. This is not minor activity. This is preparation for something massive. The breakthrough comes in early June, roughly 3 weeks before the historical launch of Bagration. A signals intelligence unit intercepts fragmentary Soviet radio traffic that contradicts the carefully orchestrated deception broadcasts. An analyst notices the discrepancy. Within 48 hours, the evidence lands on the desk of Field Marshal Ernst Busch, commander of Army Group Center. For once, the warning is heard. For once, the High Command acts. Army Group Center receives 2 to 4 weeks it never had in our timeline. Busch immediately orders his forces to begin intensive defensive preparations. The 80mm flak guns scattered across Belarus in anti-aircraft roles are repositioned to cover likely tank approach routes. Anti-tank gun crews from the PK-43 battalions receive orders to establish interlocking fields of fire along every major road and forest trail. Engineers begin laying minefields at critical choke points. Panther and Tiger tanks, the few available, are positioned in the hull-down defensive positions covering open ground. Every bridge over the Berezina and Dnieper rivers becomes a fortified strongpoint. The numbers tell the story of what the Soviets are about to face. Over 2.3 million Soviet personnel are massing across 4 fronts: the 1st Baltic Front, 3rd Belarusian Front, 2nd Belarusian Front, and 1st Belarusian Front together field approximately 5,200 tanks and self-propelled guns. They have 31,000 artillery pieces. They have 5,300 aircraft. In our timeline, this overwhelming force achieved complete surprise and shattered German defenses in days. But now, those same forces are advancing toward an enemy that knows they are coming. The 2.3 million Soviet personnel and 5,200 tanks massing for Bagration are now driving toward prepared defenses, pre-sighted kill zones, and an enemy that has had weeks to exploit every advantage the terrain offers. With weeks to prepare and full knowledge of where the Soviet hammer would fall, German forces could now exploit the one advantage that had saved them before: the terrain of Belarus itself. Belarus is not tank country. The geography that makes it strategically vital also makes it tactically treacherous. Dense forests stretch for dozens of kilometers. Extensive swamps turn off-road movement into a nightmare. The road network is limited, forcing mechanized forces into predictable corridors. For an attacking army relying on speed and mass, Belarus channels everything into narrow approach routes. For a defending army with time to prepare, those same channels become killing grounds. German engineers study the maps with fresh urgency. Every approach route to the German defensive line is analyzed. Every forest trail wide enough for a tank column is identified. Every river crossing is catalogued. The Berezina River becomes a particular focus. In 1812, Napoleon's Grande Armée was devastated trying to cross the Berezina during its retreat from Moscow. The river's steep banks and limited crossing points made it a natural barrier then. In 1944, with modern anti-tank weapons covering every bridge and ford, it will become a graveyard. The 80mm flak gun is one of the most feared weapons on the Eastern Front. Originally designed as an anti-aircraft gun, it proved devastatingly effective against tanks. At 1,000 meters, the 80mm flak 36 can penetrate roughly 110mm of armor. The T-34, the backbone of Soviet tank armies, has 45mm of frontal armor. At typical engagement ranges, an 88mm round goes through a T-34 like a knife through paper. The newer PAK-43 anti-tank gun, also 80mm caliber, is even more powerful. It can penetrate 165 meters of armor at 1,000 meters. These weapons are positioned in carefully camouflaged positions along every likely Soviet approach route, with interlocking fields of fire, ensuring that any tank entering the kill zone will be engaged by multiple guns simultaneously. The German Panther tank mounts a 75mm gun, capable of penetrating 120mm of armor at 1,000 meters. The Tiger EI carries an 88mm gun with similar penetration. Both tanks have frontal armor thick enough to shrug off most T-34 rounds at range. When used in static defense, positioned hull down so only their turrets are exposed, these tanks become nearly invulnerable pillboxes. The few Panthers and Tigers available to Army Group Center are positioned to cover critical sectors, each one commanding open ground that Soviet tanks must cross to reach German lines. Minefields are laid with methodical precision. Engineers position anti-tank mines along the edges of forest trails, in the approaches to bridges, and across open fields that might otherwise offer Soviet tanks room to maneuver. The mines force Soviet columns to slow down, bunch up, and expose themselves to anti-tank fire. Behind the minefields, machine gun positions and infantry strongpoints wait to engage Soviet infantry trying to clear the obstacles. Otto Karius, the Tiger tank commander, who would later become famous for his successes around Narva in Estonia, provided a tactical template that is now replicated across the entire Belarus front. Karius's method was simple but devastatingly effective. Exploit terrain for concealment, hold fire until enemy tanks enter the kill zone at close range, then open fire with overwhelming violence. At Narva, Karius and his crew destroyed dozens of Soviet tanks in single engagements by using exactly these tactics. Now, hundreds of German gun crews across Belarus are implementing the same approach. The forests that concealed Soviet preparations during their buildup now become death traps. German anti-tank teams position themselves in the tree lines, with clear sight lines across the few trails wide enough for tank movement. The limited visibility in the forests means engagement ranges will be short, often 100 meters or less. At these ranges, even the lighter German anti-tank weapons like the Panzerfaust can penetrate T-34 armor through the weaker side and rear plates. Infantry squads equipped with Panzerfausts and magnetic anti-tank mines wait in ambush positions, ready to swarm any Soviet tank that penetrates the first defensive line. The river crossings receive special attention. Every bridge over the Berezina and Dnieper is covered by at least 2 anti-tank guns with pre-sighted firing positions. Engineers prepare demolition charges on the bridges themselves, ready to blow them if Soviet forces break through. The approaches to each crossing are mined and covered by machine guns. Any Soviet tank attempting to force a crossing will have to advance through a gauntlet of fire with no room to maneuver and no cover. Historical examples from other sectors of the Eastern Front in 1943 and 1944 demonstrate the lethality of these prepared defenses. At Kursk in July 1943, Soviet forces created defensive belts with minefields, anti-tank guns, and dug-in tanks that inflicted catastrophic losses on attacking German armor. At Narva in early 1944, German forces used similar defensive tactics to hold off Soviet attacks for months, creating what Soviet tank crews called tank graveyards, where dozens of destroyed vehicles littered the approaches to German positions. The kill ratios in these defensive battles regularly reached 8 to 10 Soviet tanks destroyed for every German tank lost. The trap was set, the kill zones prepared. Now, 50 to 100 Soviet tanks would discover what happens when surprise is replaced by prepared defenses. June 23, 1944. Instead of breakthrough, the Soviet tank armies drive straight into hell. The offensive begins as planned. Soviet artillery opens up with a massive barrage from 31,000 guns. The bombardment is supposed to pulverize German defenses and clear the way for the tank armies to exploit. For hours, shells rain down on German positions. Then the barrage lifts. The tanks roll forward. Historically, Operation Bagration achieved advances of 100 to 200 kilometers in the opening phase. Soviet spearheads broke through German lines within days, encircling entire German divisions and racing toward Minsk. The German defensive crust shattered under the weight of the assault. But that success depended entirely on surprise. German forces were caught unprepared, with reserves in the wrong places and defenses incomplete. In this alternate timeline, the Soviet tanks advancing through the smoke of the artillery barrage discover something different. The German positions are occupied. The anti-tank guns are manned and waiting. The minefields are extensive and well-placed. The kill zones are active. The lead Soviet tank formations are channeled into narrow defiles by the terrain and the minefields. Forest trails that looked like viable approach routes on the maps turn into shooting galleries. German 88mm guns and K-43s, positioned in camouflaged emplacements with clear fields of fire, open up at optimal ranges. At 1,000 meters, the German gunners can see the Soviet tanks clearly. The Soviet tank crews cannot see the German guns. The first indication many T-34 crews have that they are in a kill zone is when an armor-piercing round punches through their frontal armor and detonates inside the crew compartment. The engagement is one-sided. The German guns have superior range, superior penetration, and the advantage of prepared positions. The Soviet tanks are advancing across open ground or along predictable routes, silhouetted against the sky or framed by the forest trails. German gunners trained for exactly this scenario engage target after target. A well-trained 80mm crew can fire 15 rounds per minute. In the opening exchanges, Soviet tank companies are gutted before they can even identify where the fire is coming from. Bridge approaches become killing grounds. Soviet tank columns advancing toward the Berezina River. Crossings find the bridges intact, but the approaches covered by concentrated anti-tank fire. The lead tanks are hit and disabled, blocking the narrow approaches for the vehicles behind them. Soviet commanders order the following tanks to push forward. They drive into the same fire that destroyed the lead vehicles. Within hours, the approaches to key bridges are choked with burning T-34s, the wrecks piled 2 and 3 deep. Dmitry Loza, a Soviet tank company commander who fought through the war and later wrote memoirs of his experiences, described scenes exactly like this at other battles. He called them tank graveyards, where destroyed vehicles littered the ground and follow-on forces had to navigate through fields of burning metal. Coordination failures compound the disaster. Soviet doctrine called for combined arms operations with tanks, infantry, and artillery working together. But the speed of the planned advance and the shock of encountering prepared defenses disrupts coordination. Tanks advance ahead of their supporting infantry. When they hit minefields, there are no engineers immediately available to clear paths. Tanks bunch up at obstacles, presenting concentrated targets for German artillery, Soviet artillery, which fired its preparatory barrage based on pre-planned targets, cannot rapidly shift fire to suppress the German anti-tank guns now revealed by their muzzle flashes. In the forests, the the nightmare intensifies. German infantry teams armed with Panzerfausts wait in ambush. The Panzerfaust is a single-shot anti-tank weapon, effective at ranges up to 100 meters. In the close confines of the forest trails, 100 meters is point-blank range. Soviet tanks advancing in column, unable to maneuver off the trails because of the trees and undergrowth, present perfect targets. German infantry let the lead tanks pass, then emerge from concealment to engage the following vehicles from the side and rear, where T-34 armor is thinnest. A Panzerfaust round to the engine compartment can immobilize a tank. A hit to the side hull can penetrate and kill the crew. Soviet tank crews trapped in burning vehicles, or forced to bail out under machine gun fire, experience close-quarters combat at its most brutal. The technical disparity becomes murderously clear. The German PAK-43 can penetrate T-34 armor at 1,000 meters. The T-34's 76mm gun, the standard armament on most Soviet tanks in 1944, is ineffective against German heavy tanks at those ranges. Soviet tank crews find themselves in engagements where they can be killed long before they can fight back. The few Soviet heavy tanks, the KV-1s and IS-2s, have better armor and guns, but they are outnumbered and just as vulnerable to the massed German anti-tank defenses. Historically, Operation Bagration cost the Soviets approximately 60,000 casualties and roughly 1,000 tanks lost in the opening phase. These were acceptable losses given the stunning operational success. The Red Army shattered German Army Group Center, advanced hundreds of kilometers, and opened the road to Poland. But in this alternate timeline, where Soviet forces are attacking into prepared defenses rather than achieving surprise, the arithmetic changes catastrophically. With lead formations channeled into kill zones, bridges turned into death traps, and coordination failures leaving tanks unsupported in minefields and ambushes, Soviet losses in the first week triple. Estimates based on historical defensive battles with similar force ratios and defensive preparations suggest losses of 180,000 to 240,000 casualties. Tank losses reach 2,000 to 3,000 vehicles destroyed in the first week alone. These are not the losses of a successful offensive. These are the losses of a disaster. With 2,000 tanks burning in the forests and at river crossings, Soviet commanders faced a nightmare. Their offensive was stalling, but their orders demanded advance at any cost. Inside a T-34, advancing through the Belarusian forests, the crew hears the radio chatter go silent, one unit at a time. The crew is 5 men. The driver sits in the hull, peering through a narrow vision slit. The gunner and loader are crammed into the turret with the commander. The radio operator mans the whole machine gun. They have trained together for months. They trust each other. Right now, that trust is all they have. The forest trail is narrow, barely wide enough for the tank. Trees press in from both sides. The driver keeps the T-34 centered on the trail, following the tank ahead. The forest is dark despite the daylight. Smoke from burning vehicles drifts through the trees. The radio crackles with fragments of transmissions. A company commander calling for artillery support. A panicked voice reporting tanks hit, then static. The tank ahead explodes. No warning, just a flash and a boom, and suddenly the trail is blocked by a burning wreck. The driver slams the brakes. The T-34 lurches to a stop. The commander is screaming orders, but there is nowhere to go. The trees are too close to turn around. Backing up on the narrow trail is almost impossible. They are stuck. The German anti-tank gun that killed the lead tank is somewhere in the forest to the right. The crew cannot see it. The commander traverses the turret, searching for a target. The gunner peers through his sight. Nothing but trees and smoke. Then another flash. The round hits the T-34 on the frontal glacis, the sloped front armor. The tank is designed to deflect hits there, but this is an 88mm armor-piercing round traveling at over 1,000 meters per second. The round punches through the armor like it is cardboard. The penetration creates a spray of molten metal fragments inside the crew compartment. The driver dies instantly. The radio operator is wounded, screaming. The turret crew is stunned by the impact, but alive. The commander knows they have seconds. He orders the crew to bail out. The loader throws open the turret hatch. Machine gun fire rips through the trees. German infantry is close, close enough to hear. The loader is hit as he climbs out, tumbling off the side of the tank. The gunner follows, dropping into the undergrowth and crawling away from the burning vehicle. The commander is last out. He can hear the radio operator still screaming inside the hull, but there is no time. The ammunition is cooking off. The commander runs. This scene is replicated hundreds of times across the Belarus front in the first week. Soviet tank crews, trained to exploit breakthroughs and race deep into German rear areas, instead Mordi find themselves in close quarters battles in forests and at river crossings where every advantage belongs to the defender. Dmitry Loza, the Soviet tank commander, whose memoirs provide some of the most detailed accounts of armored combat on the Eastern Front, describes similar experiences at other battles. He wrote about watching entire tank companies destroyed in minutes when they advanced into German kill zones. He described the helplessness of being inside a tank under fire from an unseen enemy, knowing that any second could bring the round that penetrates your armor. He described the smell of burning tanks, a mix of diesel fuel, explosives, and something worse that no one wanted to name. The technical realities of tank combat in 1944 are unforgiving. A T-34 hit by an 88 mm armor-piercing round usually bruise up, the ammunition and fuel igniting in a catastrophic fire. Crew survival rates in a brewing tank are low. The few seconds it takes to realize the tank is hit, open the hatches, and bail out are often not enough. Tank crews who do escape face German machine gun fire and infantry attacks. Survival rates for Soviet tank crews in heavy combat were among the lowest of any military specialty in World War II. At the river crossings, the nightmare takes a different form. Soviet tank battalions ordered to force crossings of the Berezina advanced toward bridges under concentrated anti-tank fire. The approaches are narrow, funneling the tanks into single-file columns. German gunners have pre-sighted every meter of the approach. They hold their fire until the Soviet tanks are committed, too close to the bridge to turn back. Then they open up. The lead tanks are hit and disabled on the bridge itself, creating an obstacle that blocks the entire crossing. Soviet engineers try to push the wrecks aside or establish alternate crossings. German artillery targets the engineers. The riverbanks become choked with destroyed vehicles and dead men. The close-quarters nature of the fighting exploits every vulnerability of the T-34. The tank's side armor is only 45 mm thick. The rear armor is even thinner. In the forests and at the river crossings, German infantry can approach close enough to attack with Panzerfausts and magnetic anti-tank mines. A Panzerfaust hit to the side or rear can penetrate and kill the crew. Magnetic mines placed on the engine deck can immobilize the tank or set it on fire. Soviet tank crews, trained for mobile warfare in open terrain, are forced into urban warfare-style fighting in the forests where their advantages in speed and numbers are negated. The psychological toll is immense. Tank crews watch their comrades die. They listen to the radio as unit after unit reports catastrophic losses. They advance knowing that the next kilometer might bring them into another kill zone. The orders keep coming. Advance, take the objective, break through. But there is no breakthrough. There is only the next ambush, the next minefield, the next river crossing under fire. As individual tank crews fought for survival in burning vehicles and forest ambushes, the strategic situation was collapsing. Soviet spearheads were overextended, undersupplied, and vulnerable. A tank without fuel is just a stationary pillbox. And Soviet tank armies are running dry. Soviet operational planning for Bagration was based on the assumption of rapid breakthrough and exploitation. The tank armies were supposed to punch through German defenses in the first days, then race 100 to 200 kilometers into the German rear, encircling and destroying enemy formations. The logistics system was designed to support this kind of mobile warfare. Supply columns would follow the advancing tank armies, and engineers would rapidly repair rail lines to bring forward bulk supplies. The system worked if the advance was fast and continuous. It failed catastrophically if the advance stalled. A T-34 tank consumes approximately 1.5 to 2 liters of fuel per kilometer of travel, a 200-kilometer advance, the kind historically achieved in the first week of Bagration, requires each tank to carry or be resupplied with 300 to 400 liters of fuel. Multiply that by 5,200 tanks, and the total fuel requirement for the tank armies reaches 1.56 to 2.08 million liters just for the initial advance. Soviet logistics planned to deliver this fuel through a combination of trucks following the advancing forces and rapid repair of captured rail lines. But in this alternate timeline, the advance does not happen. Soviet tank armies are stalled within kilometers of their start lines, locked in attritional battles against prepared German defenses. Fuel consumption rates skyrocket. Tanks maneuvering in combat, repeatedly advancing and withdrawing, consume fuel at much higher rates than tanks in a steady advance. Ammunition expenditure also increases dramatically. Soviet tanks planned to carry basic loads sufficient for breakthrough battles, with resupply coming from following echelons. But when the battle bogs down into sustained combat, ammunition consumption exceeds planning assumptions. The supply lines, stretched 100 to 200 kilometers from the railheads to the front, become vulnerable. German forces, no longer reeling from surprise breakthroughs, can interdict Soviet supply columns with artillery and airstrikes. The limited road network in Belarus means supply convoys are funneled onto predictable routes. German commanders, aware from their intelligence of the Soviet buildup, position forces to attack these supply lines. Trucks carrying fuel and ammunition are high-value targets. A single artillery strike on a fuel convoy can destroy enough supplies to immobilize an entire tank battalion. The logistical crisis compounds the tactical disaster. Soviet tank formations that survived the initial assaults into German kill zones now find themselves immobilized by lack of fuel. Tanks that expended their ammunition in the first days of fighting cannot be resupplied because the supply convoys are not getting through. Immobilized tank formations become stationary targets for German artillery and airstrikes. A tank that cannot move cannot retreat, cannot maneuver, and cannot exploit any tactical opportunities. It can only sit and wait for the enemy to destroy it. Historical examples demonstrate how quickly logistical failures can cripple armored operations. During the German advance into the Soviet Union in 1941, panzer divisions that outran their supply lines were forced to halt for days, while fuel and ammunition were brought forward, giving Soviet forces time to organize defenses. In 1944, during the Soviet advance into Poland after the historical success of Bagration, Soviet tank armies repeatedly had to pause their advances to allow logistics to catch up, even when facing a defeated enemy. In this alternate timeline, where the Soviet tank armies are not advancing but are instead locked in attritional combat, the logistics system designed for exploitation warfare simply breaks down. The ammunition situation becomes critical first. Soviet tanks and artillery in sustained combat expend ammunition at rates far exceeding peacetime planning assumptions. The 76mm gun on a T-34 carries 77 rounds of ammunition. In a mobile advance, this might last for several engagements. In sustained combat against prepared defenses, a tank can expend its entire load in a single day. Soviet artillery, firing in support of repeated attacks on German strongpoints, goes through ammunition even faster. The logistics system struggles to deliver enough ammunition to sustain the intensity of combat. Fuel shortages follow. Tanks that have maneuvered extensively in the forests and at river crossings, repeatedly trying to find ways through German defenses, burn through their fuel loads. Soviet logistics doctrine called for fuel to be delivered in jerry cans carried by trucks. But the trucks are being hit by German interdiction efforts. The fuel is not arriving. Tank battalions report to their commanders that they are down to 25% fuel, then 10%, then empty. The orders to continue the offensive become impossible to execute. The tanks cannot move. German forces exploit the Soviet logistical crisis. Artillery targets known Soviet supply routes and staging areas. Luftwaffe aircraft, freed from the need to support a mobile defense and able to focus on interdiction missions, strike Soviet truck columns. German infantry and mobile battle groups raid Soviet rear areas, destroying supply dumps and ambushing convoys. The Soviet logistics network, already strained by the unexpectedly high consumption rates, collapses under the pressure. Immobilized tank formations become death traps. Soviet tank crews, Unable to retreat because their vehicles have no fuel, can only dig in and try to use their tanks as stationary gun positions. But tanks are designed for mobility. A stationary tank is vulnerable to artillery, air strikes, and infantry assault. German forces methodically target the immobilized Soviet formations. The kill ratios, already lopsided in favor of the defenders, become even more extreme. Immobilized, undersupplied, and overextended, the Soviet spearheads that should have been exploiting breakthrough were instead vulnerable to the counterstroke. The hunters become the hunted. German panzers close the trap on overextended Soviet spearheads. In the historical timeline, German panzer reserves were committed to other sectors, particularly Army Group North Ukraine, based on the mistaken belief that the main Soviet offensive would strike there. When Bagration smashed through Army Group Center, there were no mobile reserves available to counterattack. German forces could only retreat, and often not fast enough. Entire divisions were encircled and destroyed. In this alternate timeline, the intelligence success that allowed German forces to prepare defenses also influences German strategic reserve deployment. With clear evidence that the main Soviet effort will target Army Group Center, German High Command shifts panzer divisions to positions where they can counterattack Soviet penetrations. These are not fresh, full-strength divisions. By 1944, German panzer divisions are shadows of their 1941 strength, often with only 50 to 100 operational tanks, instead of the 200-plus they fielded earlier in the war. But even understrength panzer divisions have mobility, hitting power, and experienced crews. The Soviet operational plan for Bagration called for deep penetrations by mechanized corps, racing 100 to 200 kilometers into the German rear to encircle enemy formations. In the historical timeline, these penetrations succeeded because German defenses collapsed. In this alternate timeline, the Soviet mechanized corps still attempt their deep penetrations, following doctrine and orders, but they do so into a tactical situation that has fundamentally changed. Instead of exploiting breakthroughs, they are advancing into a front that has not collapsed. Their supply lines stretch back through contested territory. Their flanks are exposed, and German panzer reserves are moving to cut them off. The first counterattacks come in the second week of the offensive. Soviet mechanized corps, having pushed forward 50 to 100 kilometers in attempts to find weak points in the German defenses, suddenly find German panzer battle groups striking their flanks and rear. The Germans exploit their interior lines and shorter supply routes. A German panzer division positioned 30 kilometers behind the front line can reach a Soviet spearhead's flank in hours. The Soviet spearhead, stretched 100 kilometers from its supply base and running low on fuel and ammunition, cannot rapidly redeploy to meet the threat. The forest terrain that channeled Soviet attacks now traps the overextended formations. Soviet mechanized corps that advanced along the limited road network find those same roads cut by German counterattacks. Attempts to break out cross-country through the forests and swamps prove nearly impossible. Tanks bog down, vehicles are abandoned, infantry is forced to fight its way through forests while under attack from German forces that know the terrain. The encirclements develop rapidly. German panzer battle groups, even with limited numbers of tanks, can move faster than Soviet formations that are low on fuel and disorganized by days of attritional combat. German forces cut the roads behind Soviet spearheads, isolating them from resupply and reinforcement. Soviet commanders order breakout attempts, but the mechanized corps have already lost many of their tanks to combat and mechanical breakdown. The breakout forces lack the strength to punch through German blocking positions. The historical parallels are grimly ironic. In 1941 and 1942, German mobile forces encircled and destroyed huge Soviet armies through exactly these methods: rapid penetration, exploitation of overextended enemy spearheads, and cutting supply lines. Soviet commanders in 1944 studied those disasters and developed operational doctrines designed to prevent them. But doctrine cannot overcome tactical reality. When Soviet forces penetrate without achieving breakthrough, when their supply lines are stretched and vulnerable, when German mobile reserves are positioned to counterattack, the same vulnerabilities that doomed Soviet forces in 1941 doom them again. The pockets form in the forests and along the river lines. Soviet mechanized corps, cut off from supply and reinforcement, attempt to hold defensive perimeters. They have some advantages. The same forests that trap them also provide concealment from German airstrikes and make German attacks difficult. But they have no fuel for their remaining tanks, dwindling ammunition, and no prospect of relief. German forces do not need to assault the pockets immediately. They can simply contain them and wait for starvation and ammunition exhaustion to do the work. Some Soviet units attempt breakouts. Small groups of tanks and infantry try to fight their way back to Soviet lines. A few succeed, abandoning their heavy equipment and infiltrating through the forests. Most fail. German forces covering the likely breakout routes ambush the attempts. The forests become killing grounds again, this time for Soviet forces trying to escape rather than advance. The scale of the encirclements is significant, but not comparable to the massive pockets of 1941. Soviet forces in 1944 are more experienced and better led than in the early war. They do not surrender easily, but the cumulative effect of multiple encircled mechanized corps is devastating. Each encircled corps represents thousands of men and hundreds of vehicles removed from the Soviet order of battle. The loss of experienced crews and commanders is especially damaging. These are not the poorly trained conscripts of 1941. These are veterans who survived years of war. Losing them cannot be quickly remedied. As German forces compressed the pockets and Soviet commanders desperately tried to organize breakout attempts, the scale of the disaster became undeniable. Numbers tell the story. The difference between 1,000 tanks lost and 3,000 tanks lost is the difference between victory and catastrophe. In the historical timeline, Operation Bagration was the single most successful Soviet offensive of World War II. The Red Army committed 2.3 million men, 5,200 tanks, 31,000 artillery pieces, and 5,300 aircraft across 4 fronts. In the opening phase, Soviet forces suffered approximately 60,000 casualties and lost roughly 1,000 tanks. These losses were significant but acceptable given the results. Soviet spearheads advanced 100 to 200 kilometers in the first week. German Army Group Center was shattered. Entire German divisions were encircled and destroyed. German casualties reached 381,000 killed and 158,580 captured over the course of the operation. The road to Poland and eventually Berlin was opened. Bagration was a triumph. In this alternate timeline, the arithmetic is inverted. Soviet forces commit the same 2.3 million men, 5,200 tanks, and supporting arms. But instead of achieving breakthrough, they slam into prepared German defenses. The opening week is not a triumph, but a bloodbath. Instead of 60,000 casualties, Soviet forces suffer 180,000 to 240,000 casualties in the first week alone. The killed, wounded, and missing mount at rates not seen since the desperate battles of 1941 and 1942. Tank losses are catastrophic. Instead of 1,000 tanks lost over the entire operation, Soviet forces lose 2,500 to 3,000 tanks in the first week. This represents nearly 60% of the committed armor strength. The tank armies, the elite mobile formations that were supposed to exploit breakthroughs and race into the German rear, are gutted. Entire tank brigades are reduced to handfuls of operational vehicles. The tank graveyards that Dmitry Loza described at other battles become the universal experience across all 4 Soviet fronts. Multiple mechanized corps are encircled. Historical estimates suggest that 20 to 30% of the Soviet committed armor strength ends up trapped in pockets in the forests, cut off from supply and facing annihilation or surrender. These are not just losses of equipment. Each encircled corps represents thousands of trained tank crews, experienced commanders, and supporting personnel. The institutional knowledge and combat experience they represent cannot be quickly replaced. Soviet offensive capability is crippled. The tank armies require months to reconstitute. Replacement tanks can be produced. Soviet industry in 1944 is churning out T-34s at rates exceeding 1,300 per month. But trained crews take longer to produce than tanks. Experienced commanders are irreplaceable. The logistics infrastructure needs to be rebuilt. Units need to be reorganized. The Red Army needs time to absorb the disaster and prepare for another offensive. German Army Group Center, instead of being destroyed, remains intact and is reinforced. German High Command, emboldened by the defensive success, shifts additional forces to Belarus. The front stabilizes along lines not far from where it started. The Soviet advance into Poland, which historically began in July 1944, is delayed until autumn, or potentially even later. The strategic implications cascade. The Warsaw Uprising, which historically began on August 1, 1944, in anticipation of imminent Soviet liberation, either does not happen or occurs at a different time with different results. The Soviet advance toward the Baltic states is delayed, potentially allowing more German forces to escape encirclement there. The timing of Soviet entry into the Balkans shifts. The Yalta Conference in February 1945, where the Allied leaders negotiated the post-war division of Europe, occurs in a context where Soviet forces are months behind their historical positions. The territorial and political outcomes of the war's end could be significantly different. The human cost is staggering. The additional 120,000 to 180,000 Soviet casualties in the first week represent individual tragedies multiplied beyond comprehension. If you enjoyed this story, hit subscribe for more World War II historical deep dives every week. Thanks for watching.